The rain had been falling since noon, and by the time the dinner rush began, Grace O'Coffer's shoes were already soaked through from the walk to work. She didn't own a car. She didn't own an umbrella that hadn't already turned inside out twice that month. What she owned was a 7-year-old son named Micah, a rent payment coming due, and a job at a roadside diner called the Wagon Wheel that paid just enough to keep both of those facts from colliding into disaster. And hey, welcome back! Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments. At table 9, a man sat alone. He'd been there for almost 40 minutes with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, staring at nothing in particular, the kind of stillness that belongs to people who are somewhere else entirely in their minds. His coat was expensive but wrinkled like it had been slept in. A phone sat face down beside his folded hands, silent. Grace had clocked him the moment he walked in, not because he looked wealthy, though something about the quiet quality of his clothes suggested money, but because of the exhaustion in his face. She recognized it. She wore a version of it every day. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" she asked, refilling his cup without being asked. He looked up, startled, as though he'd forgotten where he was. "No, thank you." A pause. "Actually, do you have anything a kid would eat? Something simple?" "You have a kid with you?" "Not here." He exhaled slowly. "It's complicated." "Long day." Grace didn't press. She'd learned long ago that most people who said it's complicated weren't looking for questions. They were looking for someone not to ask any. "I've got a 7-year-old myself," she said instead. "If he's picky, grilled cheese never fails. If he's dramatic about vegetables, I sneak them into the tomato soup, and he never notices." The faintest smile crossed the man's face. The first one, it seemed, in a long time. Grilled cheese and soup. Got it. She didn't know his name. She didn't know that in 6 months he would change the entire course of her life. She only knew that he looked like a man who needed someone to be kind to him, and kindness, unlike almost everything else in her life, was something Grace O'Coffer never ran short of. 3 weeks earlier, Grace had taken the evening shift because the manager, Daniel Reyes, asked her to cover for a server who'd quit without notice. She hadn't wanted to. Evenings meant paying a neighbor to watch Micah, eating into wages she couldn't afford to lose. But saying no wasn't really an option, not with Daniel, who had a way of remembering who said yes and who didn't when scheduling came around. Daniel wasn't cruel, exactly. He smiled while handing you more work, called everyone champ and superstar, and quietly made sure the hardest shifts always landed on the people least likely to complain. Grace had learned to read him the way you learn to read weather, through the pressure that built before a storm, not the words themselves. She'd been at the diner 2 years, long enough to know every regular's order, long enough to have earned the quiet respect that comes simply from always showing up. Micah's father had left before their son turned 2, and Grace had built her whole life since around one unspoken rule. Whatever happened, Micah would never feel poor, and he would never feel unloved, even if it meant cereal for dinner 3 nights a week. She was exhausted in a way that had become so constant it no longer registered as exhaustion. It simply was the temperature of her life. The wagon wheel sat off Route 9 red vinyl booths, a chalkboard specials menu that never quite got erased cleanly, a bell over the door announcing every entrance. Grace worked alongside Priya Anand, a cook with a sharp tongue and a soft heart, and Marcus, a server in his 20s who wanted, more than almost anything, to be liked by Daniel, a want that made him unreliable in the particular way ambition without integrity often is. It was Marcus who noticed a man from table 9 come back a second time, then a third. "Weird guy," Marcus said one evening. "Comes in, doesn't talk to anybody, orders the same thing every time." "You think he's going through something?" "Probably," Grace said, already reaching for the coffee pot. "He's polite, tips well. Not everything has to be a mystery. But it was in its way." The man never gave his name at first. He paid in cash exact with a few extra dollars tucked beneath the plate he never called a tip out loud. He came Tuesdays and Thursdays, always around 7, always alone, always with that same distracted heaviness, like a man doing long division in his head that never came out even. Grace didn't ask. She brought him the grilled cheese and soup unprompted after his second visit, and he looked at her with something between surprise and gratitude that made her feel, for a moment, like she'd done something that mattered. She had no way of knowing that ordinary kindness, given consistently and without calculation, was the rarest currency the man at table 9 had encountered in years. Daniel had a habit of walking the floor with his hands clasped behind his back, surveying the room like a man inspecting property he was mildly disappointed to own. It was Daniel who first suggested, in the tone of a man making an obvious joke, that Grace was getting a little too friendly with the tip jar regular. "He's a customer," Grace said. "I treat all my tables the same." Sure. Funny how he always ends up in your section." She wasn't steering him there. But she said nothing because arguing with Daniel rarely changed anything except how he treated you afterward. Over the following weeks, small things began to shift, the way small things always do before they become large things. Grace's schedule filled with the shifts nobody wanted. Slow Monday lunches. Closing shifts that ran past when the buses stopped running. When she asked Daniel about it, he'd shrug and say scheduling was just how the numbers worked out. Marcus, meanwhile, started getting the weekend dinners, the tables that tipped well. When Grace mentioned it gently in the break room, he looked uncomfortable but didn't argue. "Daniel likes reliability," he said, in a tone that suggested he knew exactly what that meant and had decided not to examine it too closely. Priya noticed everything. "You're covering for people who don't cover for you," she said one night, sliding over a plate of fries Grace hadn't ordered and wouldn't be charged for. "That's not sustainable. I don't really have another option. Everybody thinks that, right up until they don't," the man at table 9 kept humming. In the 4th week, he finally told her his name, David, offered almost sheepishly, like a man who'd withheld it out of habit rather than secrecy, and preferred, for a little while, being treated like nobody at all. He asked, eventually, about Micah, the tomato soup trick, the dinosaur obsession, the bicycle he wanted for his birthday that wasn't currently a line item Grace's budget had room for. She told him because he asked, and because there was something in his listening, a rare, complete attentiveness, that made her forget for a few minutes how tired she was. In turn, David told her almost nothing about himself, and she never asked. What mattered to her was simpler. He was struggling with something, and every Tuesday and Thursday, for 20 minutes, she could make his evening slightly lighter. That felt like enough. She had no idea the phone he kept face down belonged to a man whose name, spoken in the right rooms, could end careers or build them. She had no idea the long day he mentioned so often involved boardrooms and lawyers and a company with thousands of employees. She only knew a tired man who liked grilled cheese and asked good questions about her son. The night everything changed began like any other Thursday. David came in at 7, same booth, same order. Grace brought his coffee and, for the first time, let a little of her own exhaustion show. "Rough one?" he asked. "Daniel cut my hours again. 3rd week in a row." She forced a smile. "It's fine, I'll figure it out." "I always do. You shouldn't have to always figure it out alone. Nobody figures anything out any other way," Grace said, and went to check on another table before the conversation could go somewhere she didn't have the energy to follow. She didn't see David watching her walk away. The stillness that settled over his face, not pity, but recognition. The kindness he'd been quietly receiving for weeks had been extended by someone with far less margin for generosity than he had, and given anyway. What Grace also didn't see was Daniel, in the back office, pulling the register tape and comparing it against the tip report, finding, or claiming to find, a $40 discrepancy from her till the previous Saturday. He called her in before her shift ended. "We've got a problem. $40 short. I counted my drawer out exactly Saturday. Priya was there when I closed." Priya's not the one whose name is on the drawer. His voice was gentle in the way that made things worse, not better. "I'm not saying you did it on purpose, but I've got an owner who reviews these reports, and if I don't have an answer, it comes back on me. I can show you my count sheet. I photograph it every night. I'll note it in your file, standard procedure. If it happens again, though," he let the sentence trail off, the threat more effective for being unfinished. Grace left with her hands trembling, not from guilt, but from the helplessness of being disbelieved by someone who controlled whether she could pay rent. She said nothing to anyone. She went home, paid the babysitter with money she'd been saving toward Micah's bicycle, and lay awake most of the night, certain and powerless in equal measure. She didn't know, and wouldn't know for weeks, that Daniel had pulled the $40 from her drawer himself. On a night she'd stepped away to help an elderly customer to her car, a small, invisible theft folded into a pattern he'd used before, on other servers, whenever he needed a scapegoat to keep his own numbers clean for the owner's review. She also didn't know that the man in booth 9 had already begun quietly asking questions of his own. David had noticed things a distracted man might have missed. Except he wasn't distracted about this. He'd noticed Grace's shifts turn erratic. He'd noticed the tightness in her shoulders whenever Daniel walked the floor. What none of them knew was that 6 months earlier, an investment group David chaired had acquired a controlling stake in the small restaurant holding company that owned the Wagon Wheel and 11 other diners across 3 states, a modest acquisition by his usual standards, almost sentimental, since his own father had waited tables in a diner much like it decades before. He hadn't planned to become a regular. He'd simply stopped coming home some evenings because the silence there had grown unbearable since his wife's sudden death and the bitter custody fight that followed with her family, who questioned, thinly but painfully, whether he traveled too much to be a fit father. The Wagon Wheel was just the place he'd happened to stop the first night he couldn't stand the quiet, and then kept returning, because a tired waitress with her own impossible math had treated his exhaustion as ordinary and survivable because to her, it was. The night after Grace was accused of the shortage, David arrived to find a different server covering table 9, who told him, apologetically, that Grace had been moved to lunch shifts for now. David didn't ask her about it directly. Instead, from his car in the parking lot, he made 2 calls, one to the restaurant group's regional operations director, one to a forensic accountant he retained for exactly this kind of quiet work. He asked for a full 90-day review of every registered discrepancy filed at the Wagon Wheel, cross-referenced against shift schedules and the manager's own financial activity. He asked for it done discreetly within the week. It was not dramatic, no confrontation, no raised voice. Just a quiet man in a parked car, setting something in motion that Grace wouldn't learn about for 10 days, and wouldn't fully understand for 3 weeks after that. The review took 8 days. What it found was not subtle once someone with the right access looked. Across 5 months, Daniel had filed 11 discrepancy reports, all on shifts covered by 3 servers, Grace among them, each timed within a day or two of small, otherwise unremarkable withdrawals into his own account. Security footage showed him accessing the register alone on 4 of those nights, at hours he had no operational reason to be near it. Buried in a folder off the shared drive were complaints going back nearly 3 years. Retaliatory scheduling, redistributed tips, a pattern of a manager building a reputation for efficiency on the backs of employees he'd quietly undermined whenever it served him. David read the report twice in his downtown office, on a Tuesday that should have been his day at the diner but wasn't because there was somewhere more important to be. He thought about Grace's exact count sheet, photographed as a matter of habit, not suspicion, now the single most important piece of evidence in the file. He thought about how many people, over how many years, had likely done exactly what she'd done, swallowed an injustice because fighting it cost more than surviving it did. He called the regional director back. "I want Daniel Reyes terminated by end of week for cause fully documented. And every employee with an unresolved discrepancy tied to his tenure needs their file corrected immediately. Understood." "And the waitress, Okafor? Her file flags a shortage from 3 weeks ago. Clear it. Note it as an internal error, unrelated to her conduct. Restore her full hours this week." He paused. "And I want her considered for the assistant manager opening at that location. 2 years there, strong customer relationships, and from what I've read, more integrity than the man who's been managing her. That's not typically how we fill those roles, sir. There's a formal process. Then let's run it, fairly, this time. She deserves the chance to earn it. She just hasn't had one yet." Grace found out the way most employees find out about the things happening above their heads, secondhand, in fragments. By Friday, a district manager named Elena Vasquez was in the back office going through files. Grace was called in that afternoon, certain she was about to be fired. Instead, Elena slid across a formal letter stating the discrepancy report had been reviewed, found to be the result of documented managerial misconduct unrelated to Ms. Okafor's performance, and removed from her file with an apology for the disruption. "I don't understand," Grace said, reading it twice. "What happened to Daniel?" "He's no longer with the company," Elena said, carefully neutral. "There was an internal review." It wasn't just about the discrepancy reports. Grace sat with the particular vertigo of being vindicated for something she'd never stopped believing was true, but had started to fear no one else would ever confirm. "There's one more thing," Elena said, sliding over a second document. "The assistant manager position here is opening up. Given your corrected record, the district would like to consider you for it. There's a short interview process, but I'll be honest, your file is one of the strongest we have across the region. I'd like the chance, at least. Grace said finally. You've earned more than a chance, Elena said. You've earned a real shot. Grace got the promotion 3 weeks later, through an interview process that, for once, actually measured what it claimed to. Her first act as assistant manager was small but deliberate. 2 staff members present for every register audit, and a documented appeals process before any discrepancy could be logged permanently. She quietly restored fair scheduling for every server who'd been sidelined under the old system, including Marcus, whom she chose not to punish for choices made under pressure from a manager who'd rewarded compliance and punished honesty. People often make small betrayals not because they're cruel, but because the system around them makes cowardice the path of least resistance. Fixing the system mattered more than punishing the people who'd survived it. It was almost 2 months before Grace saw David again. He came in on an ordinary Thursday, same booth, same faintly rumpled coat, and she brought his coffee with the same easy warmth she always had, not yet knowing what she was about to learn. I heard congratulations are in order, he said, assistant manager. Big change. You heard right. She slid into the booth across from him, an informality she wouldn't have risked with any other customer. Feels good. Long time coming? I imagine it does. He turned his coffee cup slowly, gathering the words. Grace, there's something I should have told you a while ago. I'm not just a regular here. My investment group acquired this restaurant chain about 6 months back. I chair the board. I'm the one who authorized the review that got Daniel terminated, after things stopped adding up around the time your hours got cut. Grace sat very still, recalibrating the last 2 months in real time. You own the diner. The company that owns it, yes. I should have told you sooner. At first I didn't because I wanted somewhere to sit that didn't feel like part of my actual life. Later, I didn't because I was afraid you'd start being kind to me because of who I was. Instead of just being kind, the way you had been from the first night, when you had no reason to. I wasn't being kind because I wanted something from you, David. I know. That's exactly why it mattered. He set an envelope on the table, sliding it toward her. This isn't charity, and I need you to hear that clearly before you open it. It's a scholarship fund the company's setting up for employees' children. Education, extracurriculars, whatever a kid needs for a fair shot. Micah's the first name on the list. I've also had HR build a proper mentorship track for internal promotions across the company, based loosely on what almost happened here because it happens to good employees more often than anyone likes to admit. Inside the envelope was a modest, but real fund, and a short handwritten note. Asterisk. For the soup, the grilled cheese, and every night you made a hard day feel survivable. I don't know what to say, Grace said. You don't have to. You already said everything that mattered weeks ago, without knowing it counted for anything. He smiled, and for the first time it reached his eyes completely. Micah's getting that bicycle. Not from me. From you because you'll be able to afford it on your own salary now, which is exactly how it should be. This is just for the things a salary alone can't always cover. 6 months later, the wagon wheel looked the same from the outside. Same red vinyl booths, same stubborn chalkboard specials no one ever erased quite cleanly. Inside, something fundamental had shifted. Grace ran the floor with the same quiet steadiness she'd always carried, except now it had authority behind it, and the servers who worked under her spoke of her the way she'd once spoken of the customers she cared for, with the specific, unforced respect that only gets earned, never assigned. Micah got his bicycle bright red. Exactly the model he'd circled in a catalog with a determination Grace found almost unbearably endearing. He rode it up and down their street every evening until the streetlights came on. And some nights Grace watched from the porch step with a cup of coffee she drank because she wanted to, not because she needed the caffeine to survive another double shift. David still came by on Thursdays, though less like a man escaping his life and more like a man who'd found a place he still belonged. Custody of his son resolved with far less bitterness than it had begun, and some evenings he brought the boy along. And Micah and David's son ended up sharing a booth and a plate of fries while the 2 adults talked quietly nearby, no longer strangers. Not quite something with a simpler name either, just 2 people who'd found, in an unlikely diner off Route 9, the kind of steady friendship neither had expected to need, and both had needed badly. Grace kept the handwritten note tucked inside the frame of a photograph on her kitchen windowsill. Micah on his new bicycle, grinning, one front tooth missing, sunlight catching the red paint. She looked at it most mornings before her shift, not as a reminder of what she'd been given, but of something simpler and more permanent. That kindness offered without calculation, without the expectation of ever being repaid, had a way of finding its way back around in forms no one could have predicted. She hadn't known that rainy Thursday 2 years ago, that the tired man in the wrinkled coat at table 9 would change the entire shape of her life. She'd only known he looked like someone who needed a little warmth, and she'd had some to spare. It turned out that was enough, not because kindness comes with guarantees, but because, every so often, if you're patient and honest, and you keep showing up the way you always have, the world remembers to be kind back. If this story touched something and you hit that like button, it helps this channel grow. Subscribe if you haven't, because we share stories like this every day.